One thing that a lot of you guys have been asking me about in the comments of my previous videos is how to get your vocals to sit properly in a mix, and most importantly, how to get them to stand out over competing sounds. Now, I have done a few videos in the past that show you how to get vocals to cut on top of a 2-track instrumental, for example, but you might be dealing with this issue on a more micro level in terms of maybe you have a piano or some other lead sound that's also competing with your vocal, and you want to have a better idea of how to get that to cut on top, but at the same time without totally killing that competing sound. Now, in today's video, I'm going to talk all about that. I'm going to break down how I like to get my vocals to sit on top of other elements in a mix and how you can ultimately do the same. Are you ready? Let's go. What's going on, ladies and gentlemen? This is your boy 5-Piece producer and engineer extraordinaire. Thank you for checking out today's video, and I wanted to start with a little preface or something to be mindful of. This video, while I am going to show you how to get a vocal sound to sit on top of a mix, it's not necessarily going to be a straightforward walkthrough. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight 5 different things that you should be mindful of and that you should probably do in a mix to get your vocals to stand out on top of a competing sound. So I'm going to pull up a few different examples in the process, and at the same time, while I am going to explain some things, chances are that I'm going to refer to some of my other videos that might explain some of these subtopics a little bit better. So definitely pay attention throughout the video for cards that will be popping up in the top corner, and I'll also put links in the description below if there's anything that I reference specifically that you should check out. Now, with that in mind, let's jump on to Pro Tools and let's talk about the first thing you need to be mindful of when it comes to getting your vocals to sit properly in a mix. So the first thing that we need to be mindful of is arrangement. Now, this might be something that's out of your control, especially if you're not producing or composing the instrumental tracks. Maybe you're an artist that's recording themselves and mixing themselves. Maybe you're an engineer that's mixing somebody else's files. These are all acceptable situations to be in. They're very common. I'm in that situation as well. But at the end of the day, the easiest way to get a vocal to sit properly in a mix and cut on top of other elements is to have the appropriate arrangement for it. So what I mean by that is there needs to be room for the vocal, right? And sometimes on some tracks, there is just a lot happening, and that makes it much more challenging for the vocal to cut because it's competing against multiple elements, right? This could be very common in electronic music and hip-hop music at times, especially when you have layers and layers of sounds, leads, pads, pianos, choirs, all kinds of stuff. The more stuff there is, the more that's competing with the vocal, and therefore the harder it's going to be for that vocal to cut. Now, keep in mind, of course, I am going to show you in the next steps how to overcome some of this stuff, but one thing that I wanted to suggest to you is, if it's possible, review the arrangement, especially if you have the track outs to a song, and figure out if there's stuff that you can reduce or remove. But before you obviously go that far, you need to make sure that you identify what is competing with the vocal sound in the first place, because again, there's going to be a lot of elements in a track. There's going to be drums and basses and leads and synths and all kinds of stuff. Of course, it's going to vary based on the song that you're working on, but each of these elements, once again, may compete, and some will compete with the vocal more than others. So for example, a sub bass is probably not going to compete with a vocal as much as a lead or a piano sound that's playing in the C3 kind of range might, depending on the vocalist, right? So what I'm ultimately getting at is you want to identify the sounds that are actually directly competing with the vocal and then make a decision to process or do something about that, so that way those sounds sort of get out of the way and compete less with the vocal and ultimately make room for the vocal. So with that in mind, I have this track here. It's Above the Bar by Sorry. You guys might recognize it from some of my past videos, but I'm going to play a moment of this track and let you listen to it. And again, we're going to focus specifically on the instrument sounds because chances are drums and the basses and that stuff is not really going to compete here. It's really your melodic instruments, your progressions, your melodies, your chords. Those are the things that are really going to compete with the vocal, and those are the things that you're probably going to want to treat. But first, once again, let's identify what those sounds are in this particular track. So I'll play this moment here, and then I'll break down exactly what's competing, and we could talk about next steps in the coming sections.
I'm a rare gem, so I pissed out a stone. Nausea through change, don't try calling my phone. Wheelchair sitting, I just wanna go home and make moves, cause I'm true to what I'm on.
So really there's three sounds here, and these sounds ironically compete with each other a little bit as well, but they also compete with the vocal, right? So you're obviously going to want to manage different things, but because we're focused on the vocals here, let's identify these. So the first sound here is a piano pad, okay? So I'll just play it on its own. The other one is another type of piano pad, but with a choir. And the final one is a synth bell sound. Now, as you can tell from the arrangement, all three are not necessarily playing at the exact same time, but then in this particular section they are. So that means the vocal has more competition during this part of the arrangement than, say this section. There is obviously still competition, but what I'm saying is each section will require its own treatment. Now, of course, we can't necessarily mute this. This is an important piece of this part of the arrangement, and it's important to the artist especially. And you have to be, delicate when you're making decisions, because sometimes if you mute something, you might ruffle some feathers because that's important to the song and the artist doesn't want to remove that. But in other situations, you might actually be able to mute it. So, if we decided that this section was not as important to have the bell there, for example, I could, crop it and then mute it, right? Now, this is an ideal scenario. This is assuming that things sound so busy that me muting this is not noticeable. But this is ultimately what I'm getting at by saying, the arrangement can be very important. And this is why it's so much easier to mix minimalist songs, right? Songs that don't have a lot of elements. When you have a song that has just, a few drum sounds, one instrument sound, and a bass sound, well, it's significantly easier to manage that with a vocal than it is a dense arrangement with many sounds occupying the same type of range. I sort of mentioned this at the beginning of this section. Now, if you aren't as skilled as me in terms of just being able to recognize what sounds are going to be competing with the vocal, don't you worry. In the third section of this video where I talk about frequency and EQ, I will show you how to identify this a little bit easier. Now, me, obviously, I've done this for a while, so I could just sort of listen and realize, hey, like these sounds are preventing me from hearing the vocal as clearly as I should, and therefore I need to do something about it. But if you don't have that ability yet, keyword yet here, you will eventually develop this with practice. Again, pay attention to section 3 because I'm going to show you how to identify that much more easily. Now, this is a good segue into the second section here, which is volume and gain staging. So obviously, when we're dealing with a sound or dealing with competing sounds, we first need to be able to hear them in order to know what to do next. So if I can't hear a sound, then obviously I'm not going to know if they're even competing in the first place. And volume is really 80 to 90% of mixing, in my opinion. If you could just set your levels correctly, you'll probably minimize or avoid a lot of the issues that you have. However, of course, the next steps will take that a step further because sometimes volume alone is not enough to solve a problem. Now, by the way, if you don't have a great idea of how to set volume or level in your mix, I'll leave a link to a video right now in the corner of the screen here and in the description below. It's all about how to set levels and gain stage your mix to avoid issues and just set it up correctly. Because again, this is a big chunk of mixing. It's actually most of mixing. The other stuff, EQ, compression, while it is important and helpful, it's not necessarily everything. You have to do this volume setting part correctly in order to get the best results. Now, me personally, I always mix the instrumental first. And this is because the instrumental is usually a lot more dynamic than the vocal, and there's a lot more elements that are competing for attention. So therefore, I want to set that up first, and then I'll mix my vocal second. However, when I'm setting my levels for my instrumental, I'm not just setting them and then leaving them as it is. Sometimes that's the case, but very rarely. A lot of times what I'm doing is after I've set those instrumental levels, once I'm doing the vocal leveling and gain staging, I'll go back into the mix and then readdress things, especially competing sounds. So as an example, these three sounds that I'm talking about, after I've got my instrumental level set, now I'm bringing in my vocal sound. Let's say that I, instantly uncover and decide, hey, these three sounds are competing, or they're making it much more difficult for me to notice the vocal. What I'm ultimately going to do is I'm going to reset them as I need to. And typically what I do is I actually take the sound and I bring it all the way down to infinite, right? And then I'll remix it and I'll bring it back up, right? And of course, you want to be mindful of a few things. You want to be mindful of the opposing sounds relationship with the vocal, but then you need to also be aware of its relationship with all the other instrument sounds, because that was sort of the original context that you mixed it in. So obviously you're trying to get the best of both worlds here, but the goal here is to reset your volume levels on competing sounds and probably reducing them if they're really clashing with your vocal. Or maybe you need to do the opposite. Maybe you need to turn your vocal up. But I find that most of the time, a much easier method is to reduce competing sounds rather than increase the sound that you want to cut more. Reducing in general, whether it's EQ or something else, is always a much better method because it'll lead to less congestion, and it'll also help avoid you from clipping and overloading your channels, leading to digital distortion and other problems of that nature. So to really exemplify what I'm saying here, if I found that these three sounds are problematic, I feel like this piano pad is the main lead. So I'm going to mute these other two sounds just for the moment, and I'm going to play this and just reset this level.
I'm a rare gem, so I pissed out a stone. Nausea through change, don't try calling my phone. Wheelchair sitting, I just wanna go home and make moves, cause I'm true to what I'm on. 10 toes down, eyes open, never shut. Bringing peace to my mind, cause my scars say enough. Stay to myself with that trust in my gut that every time.
Some additional adjustment is definitely going to be required. I'm just doing this quickly for example's sake, especially here on this part of the arrangement where the bass comes in. Because you can obviously tell that the piano pad sort of gets drowned out a little bit more. But as you could tell, like being able to reduce this by about -4 really helped the vocal cut a little bit better and competed less with that vocal at the same time, while at the same time still being able to hear this piano pad quite easily. Now, once again, I probably would automate this so that way, when the bass comes in, maybe I turn it up a little bit, or maybe I have to reduce the bass volume a little bit as well. You sort of get the idea here, but just adjusting those individual sounds is going to be really key. And once again, making sure that you do it in context, because of course I have these tracks muted. I would do the exact same thing. I would unmute them, rebalance them by bringing them all the way down to infinite so I'm not hearing them, and then bringing them up into the mix until I feel like I can hear them quite clearly, where the vocal sounds quite clear and it's not competing with it as much, and at the same time while it's still sounding good in the context of the instrumental. Now, the third way to get your vocals to sit properly in a mix and not clash with other sounds is to manage frequency content, manage frequencies, and that's really with an EQ. That's traditionally how we're going to do this, and this is probably the first method that a lot of people think of, but as you can see, I had a few additional tips before we got to this one. However, this is definitely going to be a big one for sure. Now that we've identified our competing sounds, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put an EQ plugin on each of them. So let's actually just focus on this piano pad first and foremost. So this is a blank EQ, and I like to use the Pro Q3 especially, because this is going to make your life a lot easier in terms of identifying frequencies or identifying clashing frequencies, and more importantly, frequency masking. I have a great video about frequency masking, and I'm honestly going to highly recommend that you watch it. It's become one of my most popular videos on the channel for a good reason. This is a very common thing that happens, and what ultimately happens is two sounds occupy the same or similar frequency range, and they ultimately get in the way of each other, so much so that they both become less clear, muddy, and just not articulated enough. Maybe they just get lost in the mix is really what happens with the frequency masking. So with that being said, I like to use the Pro Q3 to identify frequency masking very easily and then make room on opposing sounds, okay, for each other sound, the competing sound. So in this case, on this piano pad, I'm going to use the Pro Q3 here to figure out what frequencies it's masking on the vocal. Now to do that, you want to go to the analyzer first. And first of all, you definitely want to make sure that you have a Pro Q set up on all of your vocal channels, pretty much on every channel that you want to be able to see. You could use the analyzer to display that channel and its frequency content. So while this EQ is applied to the piano pad, if I go to the analyzer and I scroll down, I have a EQ on my acapella master. This is where all my vocals go. I can click that, and when I play this section, you're going to see some red areas appearing, and that's going to show that there's a lot of frequency content that's overlapping with this piano pad, and I should consider doing something about it. You don't always need to do something about it, but it's a really easy way to see if there's some overlap of frequency masking going on. So let's check this out.
I'm a rare gem, so I pissed out a stone. Nausea through change, don't try calling my phone. Wheelchair sitting, I just wanna go home and make moves, cause I'm true to what I'm on. 10 toes down, eyes open, never shut. Bringing peace to my mind, cause my scars say enough. Stay to myself with that trust in my gut that every dime of my life is coming up. Yeah.
So I've quickly just identified some of these frequencies. And as you can tell, they sort of move, right? It's not always exactly perfect. It's not staying the same. I mean, the vocal is changing, his pitch and tone is changing. So it makes sense that this is also not always going to be the same, right? But that being said, these three general areas seem to be where there is some frequency masking taking place, meaning this piano pad has a lot of energy there, and that's sort of clashing or clouding or conflicting with the vocal sound. So what I want to do in this situation is I'm going to want to remove some of these frequencies, okay? And you can do it like I've done here where it's like static. And keep in mind, you want to listen as you do this. I'm just sort of showing you quickly. But you can just do it on a static basis where you're just losing volume on these frequencies overall consistently. But that could also be problematic. Sometimes it sounds very noticeable. It can make a sound thin, especially here because we're focusing on the lower types of bands. And this is where a lot of warmth is for a sound, whether it's a pad or something else. So what I actually like to do, and this is a pro tip in my opinion, is I actually want to do this on a dynamic basis. So what that means is I'm going to go in and I'm going to reset all of the gain here, but I still have each frequency marked, okay? Now I'm going to right click and go make dynamic for all of these bands, all right? Then I'm going to actually tell each of these bands to recognize a sidechain input. This one's already recognized. And now what I need to do is set a sidechain up so that basically my vocal, when it happens, it triggers these bands to get reduced. So I already have that set up, luckily, if I go to Vox sidechain. And basically these are now functioning like a compressor, okay? So basically whenever the vocal exceeds a certain volume, this being the threshold for each band, it's going to tell this frequency band on the pad to reduce. So let's actually just quickly set up a few of these.
Moving like a typhoon, I'm who? Come and set the wave on my type 2 IQ, about 130, don't try to tell me I'm below average status, massive. I set the bar straight. Your bar too low, I cannot relate. I'm a rare gem, so I pissed out a stone. Nausea through change, don't try calling my phone. Wheelchair sitting, I just wanna go home and make moves, cause I'm true to what I'm on. 10 toes down, eyes open, never shut, bringing peace to my...
So I'm going to bypass this, and I'll also mute the other competing sounds just to be fully clear so you can really hear what we're listening for here. And let's just see if the vocal is now, cutting on top of this piano pad. Keep in mind, I've done this really quickly, but I think this should suffice. Check it out.
I'm a rare gem, so I pissed out a stone. Nausea through change, don't try calling my phone. Wheelchair sitting, I just wanna go home and make moves, cause I'm true to what I'm on. I'm a rare gem, so I pissed out a stone. Nausea through change, don't try calling my phone. Wheelchair sitting, I just wanna go home and make moves, cause I'm true to what I'm on.
All right, so it's maybe a little bit more aggressive than I would like, but the cool thing is I could always reduce how much it goes down by. So maybe I set it to about 1 dB, which should be just noticeable, but more transparent than when I had it closer to 2. But either way, you kind of see how this works. And again, if you do want to see how to do this and you want me to break it down a little bit better, check out that frequency masking video that I mentioned earlier. The description will have the link to that video. Now, another method you can use to make sure that your vocal sits properly in a mix and stands out on top of competing sounds is to use dynamic processing, specifically sidechain compression. And I would recommend taking it up a notch and using multi-band sidechain compression as opposed to just plain old-fashioned sidechain compression, because multi-band sidechain compression will allow you to focus on a specific frequency band where the vocals should be dominant, whereas regular sidechain compression, it typically applies to the entire frequency spectrum, and that might be problematic, especially if you're trying to apply this to drum and bass sounds, because really you want the low end of those sounds to be dominated by the bass and the kick and not necessarily dominated by the vocal. However, the vocal, you'd probably want to sit better in the mids and the high end of a track or of a sound. So with me specifically on this track, this is a different song. It's Stamina featuring Oscar Sharp, Lifestyle Investor. I have this multi-band being applied to my all instrument master. So this is where all my melodic instrument sounds go. So not my drums, not my bass, but more so my pianos, my leads, my synths, my guitars. Anything like that is going to be going to this channel. And again, these are sounds that typically compete with the vocal. So we ultimately want to address these and deal with these sounds and make sure that they stay out of the way of the vocal. So that way it can basically sit and become more forward in a mix. So that being said, this multiband, it's focused on the 750 hertz to 10,000 hertz range, and you see that I have a sidechain set up, so my vocals are triggering this band to reduce every time the vocal is loud enough to be heard or felt. So just to make this really obvious, what I'm going to do is I'm going to mute all the other sounds, and I'll just let you hear exactly what I am focusing on band-wise. Take a listen to this. So this part of the arrangement is obviously guitar focused, and this guitar can sometimes get in the way of the vocal. Now if I unsolo it and we hear it in full context, and I'll put the vocal in as well.
Right. Lifestyle expanding, no compromise from gold advice, and only upgrade, don't know better. Me and my dogs, that's forever. Upgrading my life, I'm overdue, and I'm over you.
So it's somewhat subtle, but ultimately, you can tell when I don't have this in, the guitar and the other sounds are competing a lot more with the vocal, and sometimes, you know, the vocal gets a little bit lost, right? I mean, keep in mind, this is a very small move. I'm only having this reduced by upwards of 1 dB, and you want to do it gently in this case because I'm applying it to a group. However, you can absolutely apply this to an individual sound as well. The exact same logic applies, right? But either way, we're just doing this to make sure that the vocal is prioritized while still keeping things clean and making sure it sounds transparent. Now, if you want to go a little bit deeper and see how I actually use this in my mixes with a little bit more explaining, I'm going to leave a link to a video up above right now and in the description below all about how to use vocal sidechain compression. It's exactly what I'm showing you here, but again, it's going to go a bit deeper and should be helpful if you haven't really used this in the past. Now, the final method that I want to discuss in today's video is to manipulate the stereo image of competing sounds and of the vocal. So what I'm really getting at here is a vocal is essentially a mono sound. Typically, it's a mono sound. It's one microphone, one source that the artist has recorded on, and that thing should be dead center, right? But then you have these other elements that are sort of built around it, right? And a lot of times instrumental components are stereo, right? They're a left and right channel, 2 channels, and that's what you see here. I have this main synth sound that's during a piece of the same song's arrangement. It's a different section, mind you, but this seems to compete with the vocal a decent amount. And what I'm proposing here is to actually push these sounds so that they're a little bit wider. I don't want to go too crazy because we don't want to lose that mono compatibility of a sound. But if I push it a little bit wider, it should technically free up the center of the stereo image of the track for the vocal to really live and dominate in. Now, there's a few different ways that you could do this. I personally like to use isotope plugins for this. So in this case, I've actually used Isotope's Relay. And you can see here, I'm pushing the synth sound here by about 35%, which is honestly maybe a little bit aggressive, but I didn't mind it in this particular case. And I feel like I didn't lose my mono compatibility as much as I would have if I say pushed it to 100, right? So when I push it to the right, I'm actually making it wider. If I were to do the opposite, push it to the left, it would actually make the sound more mono. That being said, I want this sound to be stereo, like I said, and I want to make sure that it's out of the way of the vocal in the center field. So therefore, I'm doing this for that reason. However, if you want to be a little bit more specific, this plugin is pushing the overall, frequency spectrum, the sound in its entirety so that it's wider. If you want to use another process, maybe you want to use Isotope's Imager plugin from Ozone 9, that will actually allow you to grab specific frequency sections. So maybe you want to grab, the same type of area that I isolated in the previous step, 750 hertz to 10,000 hertz, and just push the width on that. That's totally acceptable, and I do that sometimes as well. For whatever reason, on this mix, I decided to just use Relay and do it that way. So that being said, let's check this out. I'm going to play this section. I'll bypass this. I'm going to actually still continue to keep my bass, drums, and FX muted so we can really just focus on this piece. I'll solo this sound so you first know what we're listening for. So now I'll play it again with the vocal sound in, and I'll bypass this and put it in, and let's just pay attention specifically to that synth and see if I'm able to just push it a little bit more into the stereo field and out of the way of the vocal. Really just listen to see if the vocal becomes a little bit more upfront and clear as a result of this.
Lifestyle, investor, live life, my terms, yeah. Comment on fait ça en investissement pour prendre des coups sans souci des sous. Lead mindset, we level up our whole crew, pushing our limits like we driving off a coupe. Got my whole team limit, brought the vibes of the room. Locked in, we don't play, we step up, make the rules. Facile à dire, mais dur à réaliser. J'ai continué quand elle veut tout lâcher. Célébrer la vie et bien en profiter, yeah. Lifestyle, investor, live life, my terms, yeah. Comment on fait ça en investissement pour prendre des coups sans souci des sous. Lead mindset, we level up our whole crew. Pushing our limits like we driving off a coupe. Got my whole team, limit brought the vibe.
So similar to the other steps, this is fairly subtle, right? We're not trying to do some crazy, big, audacious moves here. Sometimes, obviously, you do want to do that, but me, I try to do things very delicately and transparently. You should know this if you watch my other videos. But obviously, using the stereo imager and taking a sound that's competing with the vocal and pushing it so it's a little bit more stereo, and perhaps actually doing the opposite on the vocal. I find you don't necessarily need to do this on a vocal, but sometimes you do want to take a specific band and make it a little bit more mono. You can absolutely do that, and that should ultimately create more space for the vocal to cut through the mix. Now, if you want to see another video where I show you how to do this exact same process, but also showing you how I handle the vocal side of things using Isotope Ozone 9's Imager, I'll leave a link in the corner right now and in the description below, but check that out. It's all about how to make more space for your vocals in your mix using that specific plugin. So there you have it. These are 5 tips that I like to incorporate into my mixes so that my vocals sit better and ultimately stand out on top of competing sounds. Again, this is a very common problem that I'm sure a lot of you guys have been dealing with, and I hope you got value out of this video. Now, one thing that I did want to say is there's definitely some stuff that I didn't necessarily talk about. And one of those things is, while I did show you how this works on individual tracks for the most part, a lot of this stuff still applies to groups. So I will actually do this on various levels. So I'll do it on an individual track, and then I might apply it to a group, just like you saw how I did on that instrumental group in one example there, right? So I'll do that, and sometimes I'll even do it on the overall instrumental. Maybe I'll sidechain the entire instrumental to the vocal, but just for a specific frequency range. To be honest, I go a little bit deeper on this, specifically in one video that I have called 3 Tips for Mixing Vocals Over 2-Track Beats. Now, while it is focused on 2-track beats, a lot of that same logic applies, especially on groups and submasters. So if you want to check that video out, I'll leave a link in the top or in the description below. So definitely check that out if you have a chance. But overall, I hope you guys got value out of this video. If you did, please smash that like button until it turns blue. And if you're new here and haven't subscribed yet, definitely subscribe to the channel because I drop a new piece of content just like this every single week, always focused on helping you sound better and helping you make more money with your music. I really appreciate you guys for watching, and I'm looking forward to helping you again on the next one. All right? Peace.
5